Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Sword Art Online light novel review. This one is going to be for volume 19, which is called Mooncradle. So immediately I think I should start off with just, okay, what is this? Is this a new arc? How does this relate to the last one and so on? What's going on? So this volume, as well as the next volume, volume 20, both take place during the time acceleration phase and specifically in the underworld while this is going on. So we know at the end of Alicization that was the big threat of they had to get Alice out, eject her basically into the real world before the time acceleration was turned on, and what ended up happening was that Kirito and Asuna ended up staying behind. And during the 5 or so minutes that it took for them to turn off the time acceleration, it meant that Kirito and Asuna spent about 200 years in the underworld, even though only about 5 minutes took place in the real world. So that was the big threat of, like, could their souls handle that much time passing in the underworld? So that's where these books take place. They take place very, very early on in that time. It's not like immediately afterwards, in that, like, you get the sense like a few weeks, maybe a month or so has passed, but we catch up relatively early on in all of this while they're still sorting out basically the end of the war for the underworld. So yeah, about Reiki Kawahara says in the author's note at the end of this volume that about 5 days passes over the course of this book, which is the equivalent to about 0.08 seconds in the real world. So this is sort of, a side story type thing, but it's from a very interesting point of time for the characters, and that I think everyone wants to know a little bit more about what went on during that time when Kirito and Asuna had to stay in the underworld post end of the arc. What actually happened? What was this whole Star King and Queen Kirito and Asuna thing about? So yeah, this one doesn't really deal with that because, again, we're still very, very early on. But Kirito and Asuna are still in very strong positions in the underworld. So where we open up here, we basically have Kirito and Asuna acting as, like, very important sort of delegates in the world for basically the human side of things. We find out that Kirito is more or less considered the leader of sort of the human kind of side of things, with, of course, Finatio still being, like, the leader of the Integrity Knights. And then we find out that Iskon is the leader of the Dark Territory, and they've formed this basically kind of peace treaty between both sides, and they've started to sort of blend the two sides of the world together a little bit more. People from the Dark Territory are allowed to come and visit, Centauria, and then merchants from Centauria are allowed to, trade in the Dark Territories. And so it's slow, it's not going to happen very quickly, but progress seems to be being made. It seems like it's all positive up to now. Everything is going pretty well, and Kirito is very happy with it. There's been no incidents, really. They do establish that there was sort of some fighting that happened sort of before we start up where we are here. This is why I say a few weeks or a month have passed, because they established that there's these sort of rebellions that they had to shut down, basically in the human, like, emperors and stuff like that. They had to take down some other rulers who sort of came up in the aftermath of the war, and they just refer to that a couple of times over the course of the book. We'll see if volume 20 delves into that anymore. But it was just cool for them to reference, like, the war for the underworld and this sort of, like, rebellion that had to be crushed. But yeah. For the most part, it seems like things are heading towards peace, and that's exactly what Kirito and Asuna both want. Ronnie, or Ronnie, whichever way you want to pronounce it. I think the English dub pronounces it Ronnie, so that's just what I'm going to say because it seems to be what ends up coming out when I say it. She ends up being the main character in this book. Everything is from her point of view. So any scene we have with Kirito is from her point of view. Every scene we have with Asuna ends up being a scene that they have together, and so on. So that ends up being quite interesting in that, like, of Ronnie and TS, I definitely felt that Ronnie was the one who got the kind of least development where we've been so far, in that TS was focused on a little bit more because we saw her dealing with the loss of Yu-Gi-Oh, which she's still doing in this book, and she gets a little bit more sort sort of time to shine here, in that there's this sort of ongoing thing with her. Like, both Ronye and TS have now been promoted to Integrity Knights in training, and they are going to be, basically the slots are reserved for them, basically, that TS is going to become Integrity Knight 32 and Ronye is going to become Integrity Knight 33. That's what they're sort of destined for at this point, because they are, in their training, they're going along very, very well, and they've become very powerful. So that's where they're heading. But TS is still struggling with the loss of Yu-Gi-Oh! And not being able to let go of that. But in the meantime, it is established that she's actually become quite close to Renly, one of the other Integrity Knights, and he has actually asked her to marry him. And so the setup on her side of the story is basically, will she accept this proposal from Renly, given that she basically says she does like him and she can sort of see a future with him, but she really struggles with letting go of Yu-Gi-Oh! That Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not the person that she's going to be able to be with. And so they don't get a chance to resolve it here. It'll go into volume 20, of course, dealing with that. Again, TS wasn't really the focus here, at all, but they just left that on the table, which I thought was just something reasonably nice to do. And that, okay, there's a nice kind of relationship thing going on, because that's what they do here. We established that Finatio has given birth to her and Bercoli's child. His name is Berche, Beorche, and he's about a year old at this point. So yeah, I guess a year or so has passed where we are now. And that's just a really nice thing to see, of when she's introduced into the book, she's just okay, I have to go over talk here. Ronye, you hold on to my child while I'm doing this. And so you do get a few sequences where Ronye ends up being kind of passed over a child to sort of look after for a little bit, and that later on in the book we find out that Sheeta and Iskan have got married and have had a child as well, and her name is Lizetta, with the idea that they used the start of Lifa's name for the name of their child. So but Lizetta is the name of their child, and the position that they basically have is that, as I said, Iskan is the leader of the Dark Territory, and Sheeta is sort of the human ambassador living in the Dark Territory. So it's this marriage that kind of means a lot for the kind of peace between the nations, and of course Lizetta stands for a lot as being a child between the two nations as well, which becomes a plot point towards the end of the book, when the, I think, really action-centric side of the plot kicks off, but I'll get to that in a minute. So yeah, with a lot of that sort of relationship, kind of just political setup stuff out of the way, where we jump in with this book is that Kirito is doing some testing on the first prototype for the Dragoncraft. Now, we obviously knew about them from the end of the last volume, when we had the flash forward with the idea of oh, here's Ronye and TS's descendants into the future, and they have basically spaceships which are called Dragoncraft. And so here is Kirito introducing them for the first time. Very cool. And they obviously go into the details of how they work, and that okay, he's basically, with the help of the guy who made his sword for him, designed a fighter aircraft that sort of resembles a dragon, and then has come up with this sort of interesting use of technology and magic of putting heat elements in, containing heat elements to basically act as engines, and then having pipes filled with frost elements to cool them down so it doesn't just explode. So you just get this fun sequence as everyone is excited, because Kirito always does this crazy stuff. So he's going to test out this new machine, and he gets it up, it launches properly, gets off the ground, it's incredible in what it can do, but it kind of goes out of control, and Asuna sort of has to save the day by using her Stacia goddess powers to sort of move some buildings out of the way so Kirito doesn't crash into them. So they think Kirito's dead for a second, but he immediately sort of lands back down, and it's yeah, okay, fine. Kirito's continuing to test this, and this sort of becomes a plot point in the book in that, like, okay, he then uses the second edition of the craft when the action properly kicks off, which, again, it's from Ronnie's point of view, so you get her talking about how, like, oh, Kirito always does stuff like this, and you get her interacting with Asuna a little bit, and again, they really in this book emphasize that Ronnie is in love with Kirito, and I think it's actually quite well done the way they do it, in that she constantly addresses the idea that she knows that Kirito and Asuna are in a relationship, and she doesn't want to get in between them, but this is how she feels. Kirito is the person that she loves, and she really struggles with, as his page, and just like her connection to him from before, there's a certain loyalty that she has to him, so she sort of has to be around him, but then she's kind of constantly at odds as to how exactly how close she should or should not be, in a way. And she can see that, like, Asuna and Kirito have a connection that she doesn't quite have with him, and it's just kind of in a slightly alternate way to the way TS is still struggling with the idea of moving on from Yu-Gi-Oh, but Yu-Gi-Oh's dead. It's Ronnie trying to sort of figure out the same thing. You have both of the girls sort of realizing that, like, oh, they've got marriage proposals, especially since they've become Integrity Knights in training. They've been getting a lot of marriage proposals, because that means whoever marries them is in, like, a really high-end noble family, despite obviously the girls both coming from sort of the lower ranked noble families. So that's a kind of different experience for them, but of course their focus is on the people they love, which is Kirito and Yu-Gi-Oh, and so that's where the whole Renly thing and the marriage proposal comes in. Plus, we obviously know TS and Ronnie end up having children and descendants, so the question is, who do they get together with? It seems all but set up in TS's case, in that, like, Renly seems like a perfectly nice character, that seems like a nice pairing, why not? But who is the character for Ronnie? And I don't think they've really introduced anyone just yet. We'll see in the second part of Mooncradle if they do anything in volume 20. But yeah, they explore that quite heavily over the course of the book, because it is all from her perspective. And so in that sense, what I would say is that, like, the first, like, 2/3 of this book are very much just like Ronnie dealing with her feelings before a lot of plot really kicks off. But it is an interesting book to get, like, basically Kirito and Ronnie paired up for most of it, in that the plot properly kicks off relatively early in the book, when we find out that the peace has sort of been shattered a little bit, in a way, or is threatened, when we find out that a Dark Territory tourist in Centauria has killed someone from the Human Empire. So this is a terrible thing to happen, that the Dark Territory look terrible here. This will potentially ruin trade between both, the relationship between both. They have to sort this out. So immediately Kirito jumps into action to investigate this, and Ronnie ends up sort of tagging along, because they set up the idea that the reason Asuna isn't sort of right there alongside Kirito is that when Kirito's off doing his things and, like, exploring and being on the front lines of the investigation, there needs to be either Kirito or Asuna back remaining in the Human Empire to sort of make some big decisions, because they're more or less the leaders. So while Kirito is doing investigation, Asuna is staying back to sort of maintain control, in a way. So that's where there's a gap for Ronnie to be there, and she basically takes on that role, because, like, I'm Kirito's bodyguard. That's what I'm going to do in this book, to be around him and protect him, because he's always doing these crazy things. And Asuna's pretty okay with that. She acknowledges her position and is just like, okay, it's your responsibility to protect Kirito. And the relationship between the girls is pretty nice, because, obviously Ronnie is not being very open. She's not explaining that she likes Kirito, and of course Asuna is not bringing up that she probably knows that Ronnie likes him. We'll see where that goes again next volume also. So yeah, the murder is the big investigation. Now, they quickly figure out that the goblin who was sort of the suspect pretty much is innocent fairly quickly. They discover that, like, okay, it wasn't a goblin knife that was used, and the stories, the way they end up going, it's like, okay, The goblin was staying here as a tourist. He walked out of his room, found a bloody knife on the floor, picked it up, and was sort of caught in a very bad moment, but he didn't actually do it. It seems very clear that that's exactly what happened. And then they figure out that, oh, this isn't even a goblin knife, because it's clearly one that was just made by magic. It was just forged from like steel elements using, spatial resources, the magic system of the world. So all this brings them to being like, who could have done this? And so Kirito figures out that, okay, we have to get to the Dark Territory to immediately, as soon as possible, talk about this with ISKCON. So the two leaders of both sides have to get together to address how to handle this situation. So obviously they hold the goblin still sort of as a prisoner, but more or less they kind of calm down how serious they are about it until they figure it out. They're not going to make this public or anything, so they're sort of hiding what exactly has happened in all of this until they know the specifics. So this is where Kirito has to get to the Dark Territory very, very quickly. So this is where the second Dragoncraft comes into play, and the decision is made that Asuna is going to have to stay back, so Ronnie is going to go with Kirito. So before this happens, Asuna takes Ronnie to the armory and gives Ronnie her basically like integrity Nightblade. So she gets her divine weapon, and it's actually a really nice scene between the two girls, as we have, of course, Ronnie has such respect for Asuna, and because she more or less treats her as if she is the goddess Stacia, but they've talked enough to where she can, they can actually have a conversation, and it's just, Asuna really having the confidence in Ronnie that, like, you can do this job, but you will need a sword, like, to represent your position better than just the standard one that you have. And there's some nice talk back and forth here about, like, Asuna bringing up that, like, oh, I know you may have some trouble leaving behind this sword that you're so used to. I did as well. Kirito actually was the one who had to convince me to, like, let go of my first ever sword, referencing the stuff from Progressive, where she becomes very attached to her first blade, and so Kirito has to bring up the idea of, like, we'll melt your sword down into materials which you will then use with other materials to craft into your new sword, so your old sword will be part of your new one. And that really helped, get her through the idea of upgrading weapons and so on in those early days in Aincrad. And of course she holds back on, like, revealing that, like, oh, it was a game in this world, and that, like, it's obviously a huge thing to explain it to the Underworldians about, like, what exactly is going on, but just a thing that establishes this, like, deeper history between Kirito and Asuna to Ronnie, but it helps her realize that, okay, she needs to leave her current kind of standard sword behind and choose one of these divine objects. And so we get the whole idea of the sword chooses the wielder, not the other way around, and one of the swords that Asuna has picked out calls to kind of Ronnie and shows she chooses that. As far as this goes, it basically is just, she chooses it here. A lot of the book goes by, there's an incident right at the end where she does get to use it, and then in the aftermath of, like, a successful use of it, she names it the Moonbeam Sword. So once more, like, they haven't really got into, like, I suppose why it's called Mooncradle as such. Ronnie and Kirito had a talk towards the start of the book and then also towards the end of the book where they reference the moon. They talk about, like, what Kirito wants to do with the Dragoncrafts is to basically fly past the end walls, which seem like the borders of this world. And they start to bring up the idea of, like, you think this world realistically is flat to a degree, but if you go up high enough, you can see it's actually a sphere. You can acknowledge the moon is a sphere, so that it makes sense that what we're on is also a sphere. So what's beyond the world here? So they're basically establishing that either if we find a way to get to the moon, there's land that we can use because the Dark Territory is suffering. It doesn't have any farmland on its own where it can thrive. So we need to be able to expand into places that have more land. So we either have to expand the borders of the world and go around the sphere basically, or head up to the moon. And beyond, like, that, there's not much of a real establishment for why it's exactly called Mooncradle. Ronnie, of course, ties the word cradle into referencing the moon towards the end of the book, but there's no real kind of clear cut, ah, I see what you're going for type thing. But anyway, so she has the sword, she heads off with Kirito on the dragon craft, and they, of course, land outside of the Dark Territory and then go in. They do get across this idea that they use this sort of special kind of substance that Kirito had made earlier on to kind of make their skin more match the people of the Dark Territory, because this is not meant to be an official visit. They're trying to keep what's happened under wraps, so they do have to sort of sneak in. So you get this kind of thing of just them walking around and you realize they don't have any money. A pugilist ends up buying them some food, and then Kirito kind of gets Sheita's attention up at the palace, the Obsidian Palace, by just, you know, throwing an incarnate sword at the palace, basically, which Sheita ends up sensing. And pretty quickly they end up kind of being brought into the palace, and they inform everyone about what's going on. And it's at this point we're reintroduced to, of course, Sheita, as well as Iskon. Iskon, as I said, leader of the Dark Territory. Sheita is still sort of an ambassador between both worlds, given that she's now married to Iskon. They have their child, Lisetta, and you get introduced to her, and of course, like, Kirito gets the moment where he finds out the connection with his sister's name, and Ranye again is asked if she wants to hold Lisetta, which, you know, we get another moment there. So she ends up holding both of the babies that are kind of still fairly young in this book. And then, yeah, this is where, like, it's just a discussion of, like, both leaders are very reasonable here. There's no accusations back and forth. It's just, we need to sort this out. What's going on? And they sort of come to the conclusion of, like, oh, well, what if it actually is then people on our side, the human side of things, that are at fault for this? What do we then do? But, like, when all of this is going on, this is when, like, the big incident in the book happens, which is, like, there's an attack on the palace. And it seems like it's just these minions. These two minions are attacking them. And, of course, we know the minions are the things that Bercoli took out with the trap. So they didn't really get to see them in action. They were just sort of the random minions of the Dark Magic Guild. And they also established prior to this that the Dark Mage Guild has kind of gone underground. That all of the, like, top 10 members have just left, so we're left with, like, the random 11th best dark mage as being the one who's in charge at this point in time. So they just are like, the Dark Mages Guild is going to fall apart because they have no strong member to lead. So they're setting up straight away that the remnants of the Dark Mage Guild is still out there, and they might be behind it all. And then right towards the end of the book, they bring up the idea that also the Assassin Guild, which hasn't been mentioned at all since the Shasta stuff from Alization. We thought they were just killed, wiped out in that moment, but of course they weren't. Like, Shasta only killed, like, the leader. He didn't kill every single assassin. So what are they up to in all of this? They weren't included in the war, like, at all. So they seem to be setting up right now that it's like a combination of the Assassin Guild and the Dark Mages that are the remnants of the Empire that want to ruin the new peace that is trying to be established here. That both the leadership of the humans and the leadership of the Dark Territory do want. So while this is happening, of course, Kirito and, you know, Sheita and Iskon end up killing the two minions, but it was just a distraction. When they go upstairs, they find out that Lisetta has been kidnapped. The guards that were guarding her were defeated, and she's been kidnapped. And so there's this big search around the palace because they figure out that, look, there's no way whatever captured them, it's these minions. They're not quick enough to get away, so they have to be still here somewhere. What's going on? So they search everywhere, they can't find her. And this is when, like, they latch onto this kind of small little point that's discovered of, like, they heard this sound of sort of stone grinding against stone. And someone thought it might be, oh, a mortar and pestle. Someone was making poison. But then they're like, wait, that's the sound that obsidian doors make when they open. Was it one of them? And they come to the conclusion that it has to be the top floor of the palace, the throne room, that's been sealed off and was only used for Vecta's return. Vecta's obviously defeated at this point, so what's going on in the throne room? That's the big tease. So Kirito ends up doing a very cool incarnation attack to break the seals of this, like, powerful door. And when they get in there, they discovered this mysterious robed kind of monster, I suppose, is the best way to describe, because again, it's a mystery. They don't reveal what or who it is. And yeah, this creature has Lisetta. Now, the way the fight goes down is that he's completely outmatched here. Like, I think is it Sheeta ends up cutting off one of his arms, and then right at the end, Ronier finally uses her sword for the first time and cuts off his other arm, and she ends up being the one that properly like saves Lisetta in all of this, because Kirito used up a lot of his energy just breaking the door open, because it was, of course, the Emperor's throne room door. Of course, it takes a lot of effort to break through. And so we end with the idea of, like, to save Lisetta, they had to let the creature get away. It ran out the window and it has flown off, but it's missing 2 arms. And you're just left with this sort of mystery of, like, okay, what is going on here in all of this? They're not clear about, in terms of really making a statement about who it is or what it is, other than it's connected in some way to the Dark Mage Guild and potentially the Assassin's Guild. And the other key point is that the only actual way to open up the Emperor's throne room is to use the red jewel that was in Vecta's crown. So that's part of his character design, but now they emphasize it as being an important object. So they established that this creature actually had that on like a necklace, and that's how it was able to sort of get in and out of the throne room floor, despite it being kind of sealed off. So that's very interesting. This establishes the sort of loyalty to the old ways of Vecta. So we'll see how this properly kind of pays off as we sort of go forward. But yeah, the book pretty much like ends at that point. Like, Kirito says, okay, we're going back to Centauria to sort this out. We have to try and figure out what this is, because again, there's still a slight hint that it may be more involving the kind of human side of things. It may not be just Dark Territory stuff. It might be one of those things I might need to read the book again to fully maybe connect a lot of those dots together. But I think they do end it on more of a mysterious note about what faction is it actually meant to be, and so on. So yeah, overall I enjoyed the book, definitely. I think it was a little slow maybe at the start to get going. It's definitely not the way I would have maybe chosen to do stories referencing this time period of like the 200 years in the underworld, but I do appreciate the development that they give Ronier here, in that just seeing how skilled she is at the end with her really cool sonic leap and, you know, catching of the baby. It was a real kind of hero moment for her, and Kirito even like acknowledged that it was a very strong moment. And they get across that like Ronier at this point is like slightly ahead of TS in terms of like actually being good enough to become an actual Integrity Knight. Just because TS is sort of struggling with some of the kind of sacred art stuff, whereas Ronier is a little bit better at that. So that's, you know, why she's sort of more focused on than TS, but, you know, they both get their chances to shine. They obviously linger on a lot of the relationship style stuff here, and it is fun to see, like, okay, here's Venetia with her child, here's Sheeta with her daughter, and I suppose I will comment about Sheeta here, is like, it is interesting to see her here in that she's basically put down her sword. She says that she will never take up a sword again, and so when she fights, she just uses her hands, but she still slices with her hands, so she basically does these kind of karate chops and still cuts stuff. So she's still more or less the same, but she's agreed to not use swords pretty much anymore. So she's also talking a lot more, and especially her character that was sort of so cold in some ways, it's very interesting to see her now be that little bit more warm now that she is a mother and showing her caring for her child. And then also that Iskan is also this really kind of loving father as well. He's doing the sort of the baby voice type stuff whenever he talks to her. So it's a big contrast to obviously the leader of the Pugilist Guild and how he is with his daughter, but it's nice stuff. It's obviously not as impactful as a lot of the Alicization volumes, which had so much like plot and stuff like that going on, but I actually like the more sort of low-key mystery, in that, like, okay, 200 years, here's one of the major incidents coming off the sort of start of this kind of time period, how do they like properly establish peace and so on. So we're getting there, I suppose. So yeah, I think that's where I'm going to end this one. I think definitely I'll talk more about my overall thoughts on the arc when Volume 20 comes out, which I think is in August, so it's still a while off, but it's not too far away. So yeah, I'll have much more to say once we get, I suppose, the resolution to what's going on here, because right now it is mainly just, you know, speculation, mystery, more than anything. And most of this book is setup, which is something I'll say. There's some nice world building at the start, but it's mainly setup. So I think 20 is where most of the, like, delivering on the promise is going to come from. So yeah, they're my thoughts on Volume 19 of Sword Art Online, which is called Mooncradle. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on the book and the review, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.